Hello, we are very pleased to participate in this event. I'm Marie-Laure Gavard-Perret from Grenoble-Alpes University in France, and my colleagues are Marie-Claire Willem from the same French university, and Gilles Ngoala from another French university, Montpellier University. We are going to talk about fear appeal in prevention communication, and we will focus the attention on the prevention of COVID-19 in France. Fear appeal is very often used in prevention communication, but sometimes it is misused. The fear appeal mechanism was extensively used in France in COVID-19 prevention communication. For instance, the word alert used in the campaign conceived by Santé Publique France, or the discourse from Emmanuel Macron, the French president, totally based on the war metaphor. War, enemy, and so on. Indeed, COVID-19 puts the world's population on alert and provokes sometimes counterproductive behaviors in the perspective of an effective management of the pandemic. For instance, barrier gestures were not very well respected in France, as an article in a French news channel pointed out in March 2020. Coronavirus, the barrier gestures are not respected. Several examples coming from ordinary people or celebrities indicated in March 2020 that there was a lack of conformity, a lack of compliance with the barrier gestures advocated by the official communication campaign and by the various speeches of the French government team. These two photos refer to two situations of non-compliance with barrier gestures. In one case by a restaurant owner, and in the second case by Carla Bruni-Sarkozy kissing her friends during Fashion Week in Paris. She later apologized for her irresponsible behavior. However, this lack of compliance with the measures taken led to a high number of checks, sanctions, and a gradual tightening of the latter in France. Thus, this large-scale health crisis probably reveals the limits of French health communication policies and, more generally, of the communication of French government representatives. But above all, this crisis reveals in France a great ignorance of the theories and models of human behavior, in particular models and theories issued from psychology, behavioral economics, and marketing. However, these models provide keys to understanding persuasive mechanisms and could help to better anticipate certain reactions. These theoretical frameworks also make it possible, a posteriori, to decode and analyze many situations encountered during the first weeks of the COVID crisis, since it is on this specific period that we will focus our attention. Various observations can thus be drawn up. First observation, a lot of cases reported by the media, such as those described above, as well as data collected as part of the data COVID barometer, data collected during the first period of the crisis, show that French government and public health officials had difficulty convincing French people of the seriousness of the consequences of the epidemic on their personal level and the need to comply with the measures taken. As an example, this photo taken at a market in Paris after the decisions of barriers measures. However, the President of the Republic announced restrictive measures on March 13. Information relayed by his Prime Minister, his Minister of the Interior, and various public authorities. And an extensive multimedia communication campaign was orchestrated and broadcasted by Santé Publique France. Despite this, French people continue to take their children to parks and invite their elderly parents to spend time with their grandchildren. Yet the fear appeal was constant, especially through the incessant repetition of official messages with a very threatening tone, coronavirus alert, and with a scary jingle that reinforced the anxiety-provoking content of the messages. The media and social networks still added frightening information, such as the daily count of deaths and hospitalizations in intensive care, the President Macron's martial tone in his speech announcing the measures, and his recurrent use of warlike figures and metaphors, which were broadly taken up by members of the executive, created a general alarming and threatening atmosphere in France. Second observation, an apparent effectiveness of the use of the threat and fear. Indeed, this use of the threat and fear worked for many weeks, with a certain effectiveness, since the data issued from the Data COVID barometer indicate a rather high level of fear felt by the French. These data were collected between 15 and 21 of March 2020 with 5,000 respondents and then 6 other periods of data collection. And thanks to this data, we observe that more than 8 out of 10 people in the sample feel a moderate to very strong fear for themselves and for their loved ones. But this apparent effectiveness of the use of threat and fear was coupled with negative collateral effects, with negative side effects. Indeed, about 1 in 5 respondents also felt disturbed in the same period by experiencing on a daily basis or more than half of the days feelings of worry, tension, anxiety, loss of interest, loss of pleasure, and so on, and also felt unable to contain their worry. And more than half of the respondents experienced tension, anxiety, and nervousness for at least several days. Indeed, these symptoms are very similar to those of post-traumatic stress disorder. This imbalance of fear and anxiety was criticized by many experts. For example, an article in a French newspaper published at the beginning of September reported that academics and physicians were questioning the fear-based management of the pandemic by the government and its scientific council. Their criticism was severe against a communication deemed to be anxiety-provoking, which systematically exaggerates the dangers without explaining the causes and mechanisms. I now give the floor to Marie-Claire Willem. She is going to comment some figures.
So the main question is whether this fear and threat-centered communication has been effective in achieving compliance with barrier gestures and lockdown. It appears that despite the climate of fear and anxiety, particularly linked to an exceptionally intense preventive communication, the French have moderately complied with the health guidelines. Admittedly, they were almost unanimous, 98% in performing at least one of the barrier gestures, like washing their hands or not shaking hands all the time or often during the week under consideration. However, only one quarter systematically complied with all the measures. In addition, the implemented communication provoked unexpected reactions. For example, and contrary to all that has been said and hammered in government communication and relied by the media, the lockdown has elicited greater obedience from young people than seniors aged 65 and over, despite the fact that seniors were targeted by messages supposedly aimed at frightening them to protect themselves the risk of complications increasing very strongly with age. However, this information was given to them and repeated over and over again. How, therefore, can it be explained that the level of threat and its corollary fear has not shown greater effectiveness? Different models and theories from research in the humanities and social sciences help to decode the processes in action. These three models and theories focused on threat and fear. The Health Belief Model, HBM, by Rosenstock in 1974, the Protection Motivation Theory, or PMT, by Rogers in 1975, and the Extended Parallel Process Model, EPPM, by Witt in 1992. These models converge on the condition of effectiveness of a threat. They show that a threat is effective only if, on the one hand, it is perceived as serious, perceived severity, by those who are targeted by the threat, and if, on the other hand, they perceive themselves to be vulnerable, perceived susceptibility or vulnerability. In other words, the receiver of communications based on a threat, for example, the prospect of medical complications or even death due to the COVID-19, must perceive that the consequence of the latter could be serious in his or her life and that he or she is personally concerned. Have communications at all levels of the executive and public health organization achieved this dual objective? The data COVID barometer indicates that a large majority of respondents perceive the epidemic as serious, 88%. Only 3% felt it was not serious, but 9% could not comment on its severity. This last figure questions the communication effectiveness, since almost one French person in 10 does not feel able to judge whether the COVID-19 epidemic is serious or not. Moreover, this perception of severity of the epidemic seems abstract, general, but not integrated at the individual level as a major risk factor for him or herself. Only 37% of respondents who have not been yet infected consider themselves to be at risk when thinking about the gravity of the impacts that the virus could carry if they caught it. And again, 13%, almost 1 in 6 respondents, cannot answer. This underestimation of severity points to flaws in the communication policy. Unless it reflects a denial by some of the targets who would seek to defend themselves psychologically in the face of an unbearable threat, fear and anxiety would be too strong, leading to the defense mechanism. It can also be the expression of a comparative optimist bias, characterizing the tendency to see the future for oneself more favorably than that of others. It is interesting to note that also more seniors feel at risk than average. Only 1 in 2 uninfected seniors perceive themselves to be at risk. Yet, this group was particularly targeted, so much so that some seniors rose up in a petition against this stigmatization when the possibility of a longer lockdown of seniors was evoked. In addition to the previous biases, resistance may therefore have developed among these targets. Regarding the feeling of vulnerability, only 24% of respondents consider it rather or very likely that they or their family members will be infected in the next weeks, and more than 1 in 4 do not know how to respond. If the effectiveness of communications in terms of perceived severity already seemed a little limited in some respects, their ability to make every French person, and particularly senior citizens, feel vulnerable is very low. Therefore, the inadequacy of compliance with the sanitary rules lies in the fact that the threat was not sufficiently perceived as serious enough for its own sake and likely to affect everyone. And now I give the floor to Gilles Nguela.
Thank you, Marie-Claire. So to carry on this topic, We were very interested in the effectiveness of the communication campaigns from the French government, and we have applied the PMT and EPPM models in order to understand how fear peers interact with especially efficacy. And we looked at the perceived efficacy of the recommended response and also to the self-efficacy. It means the way that French people think that apply in a good manner the different barrier gestures that were recommended. And concerning the perceived general efficacy, we can see that 83% of French people find that the measures are somewhat or very effective, but at the same time, they consider that they could be effective only if everyone respect and comply with the different rules. So this point show that there is a doubt concerning the general effectiveness of the different measures, especially because only 56% think that the general population respect them well, and 73% think that the immediate neighborhood respect them scrupulously. So there are some belief concerning the general population, and they think that the general politics in terms of health doesn't meet all the expectations that we can have. And those beliefs alter the perception of the general efficacy of barrier gesture. Concerning the self-efficacy, only 26% are rather or completely agree with the scrupulous respect of instructions that are particularly complicated for them. But only, at the same time, only 1/4 of French people believe that they are able to implement all the barrier gestures all the time. So when they compare themselves to others, they have some comparative optimism bias that explain that there is a discrepancy when they compare them with other French people. So if there is sufficient perceived efficacy, we can see in the different results from a data COVID barometer that there is a rather good perceived efficacy of the instruction, but there is a doubt concerning the implementation of the different gestures by others. And at the same time, that they feel and they estimate that there is a high perceived self-efficacy, but at the same time, they think that there is a low actual systematic implementation of the instruction. So there is a double paradox in that case, where we see that there is some doubt concerning the general effectiveness of all the politics. And in addition to the low perceived severity and vulnerability perceived by the French people, we can see that in general there is an insufficient persuasion of the different campaigns. So if we come back to the different models, PMT models, for example, we can see that in this model they really apply to the situation, and if in this case for the PMT demonstrate that if streets is insufficiently perceived and in terms of severity and vulnerability, there is no motivation to protect oneself, no acceptance of the message, and no adaptive coping to protect against danger. From the EPPM model, we can see that if the street is perceived and fear engendered, but at the same time there is a weak efficacy perception, there is no control of danger but control of fear. And probably in the French population, many people tend to control their fear instead of controlling the danger. So we can see that there is a rise of defensive motivation and the rejection of the threatening messages that have been sent by the French government. So to conclude, we have tried and struggled to apply the different models, the HBM, PMT, and EPPM model to the French population during the pandemic. We have seen that there is a need for the French to feel personally vulnerable to the epidemic and consider it serious. There is a need also for the French to believe that the recommendations are beneficial and feasible. But we have also seen that in the result that there is an insufficient perception of the benefits of the measures taken. So at the end, we can say that there is a moderate effectiveness of the communications implemented by the French government. And to have a closer focus to different segments of population, we can see that there is some moderate effectiveness for two particular segments of population. For the young people first, because they say that they are the least able to respect barrier gesture, and we must explain them that they must apply and comply with the different recommendations, not to protect themselves, but to protect others, and especially their parents or grandparents, the most fragile. And for the senior, we can see that there is a lesser compliance with the confinements than young people. And we must explain them that they must protect themselves in order to avoid overburdening of health services, and they have to be locked down in particular to protect themselves. So this altruistic dimension has not been very well understood in the in France, and we probably have to reposition and to think about the different campaigns that have to be conducted now. Thank you very much for your attention, and we are free to answer your questions.
Patricia asks us, how
Yes.
can the government implement an altruistic campaign?
The example of a German communication campaign is particularly interesting from this point of view, because they really show to young people what they have to do in order to become heroes, because they have to do nothing to stay at home and only to stay at home in order to protect the population, in order to protect their country, like in a wartime, but with nothing to do. And this approach is particularly interesting, and maybe underline and highlight more efficiently the need to stay at home for young people and also for seniors.